My name is Michael Watson, and I'm Head of History Publishing here at Cambridge University Press. And I'm delighted to introduce Rebecca Earle. So Rebecca is Professor of History and Head of Department at the University of Warwick. And Feeding the People is, I think, her fourth book. I think that's right now. And interestingly, in those series of books, she's expanded her interest from the history of Spanish America to the global history of food, culminating in this great new book. Today, she's going to tell us all about what the history of the potato can tell us about the relationship between the individual and the state, food security, and globalization. So over to Rebecca.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. So I wanted to start by asking a question, which is to say, what do we talk about when we talk about potatoes? For years, I've been thinking about potatoes to the bemusement of friends and colleagues alike. And over the years, I've learned a lot about potatoes and also a certain amount about myself. Thinking about potatoes, I've learned, is a way of thinking about ourselves, because people and potatoes are not so different. The Irish photographer Kevin Abosh expressed this very well. Over the last decade, Abosh has taken a series of photographs of what could be called portraits of individual potatoes, one of which, in fact, sold for €1 million in 2015, a photograph of a potato. And Abosh explained his interest in photographing these single solitary potatoes in the following way. He said he saw commonalities between humans and potatoes that, he said, speak to our relationship as individuals within a collective species. Potatoes, he said, could serve, here I'm quoting, as a proxy for an ontological study of the human experience. This from a photographer. That's pretty heavy stuff for the modest potato, a proxy for the ontological study of human experience. I think attaching this sort of language, this sort of grandiose language, to a potato takes us by surprise. Because most of the time, potatoes are a byword for ordinary. They are a staple. They are dependable. They are trustworthy. She is a real potato, you say in Norwegian, when somebody is totally reliable, or at least that's what a Norwegian told me. They're stolid. They're a bit sedentary. They lack a certain get up and go, perhaps. So when your Jewish grandmother says to you, don't just lie around like a latke or a potato pancake, she means get off your backside and do something. And I think that we understand that when Karl Marx compared the French peasantry to a sack of potatoes, he didn't mean it as a compliment. All over the world, potatoes are an ordinary food. We eat lots of them. People from many different places told me this when I mentioned that I was studying potatoes. Where are potatoes actually from was another common response to learning that I was writing about potatoes. These days, the correct answer would be everywhere. China is the world's largest producer of potatoes, and the greatest potato eaters are Belarusians at 189 kilos per person per year, trailed by Russians at 136 kilos per person per year, and Ukrainians 131 kilos per person per year. At present, there are something like 4,500 classified varieties of cultivated potatoes and some 200 wild species at least. And according to the United Nations, there is not a single country in the world in which potatoes are not grown, if we exclude the 5 on which the UN has no data. And because we eat so many potatoes, they are 4th on the list of the world's most important food crops. So we absolutely don't think about potatoes as exotic. They're quite the opposite. They are utterly familiar. And their very names proclaim their rootedness in the right here, in the exactly wherever we are. They have names like Jersey Royals, Idaho Russets, Irish Cobblers, Darjeeling Red Round. So potatoes in India as well, as we in fact know if we think about Indian food. When he was growing up in 1970s India, the artist Subodh Gupta wondered whether everybody ate potatoes or whether it was only people in Bihar where he lived. A French traveler in early 19th century Colombia was surprised to see what he called European potatoes on sale alongside what he described as South American vegetables such as cassava. So to an Indian boy, potatoes are Indian. To a French traveler, they're European. This, I think, is pretty remarkable for a food that was totally unknown to most of humanity before the 16th century. Until then, the only people who ate potatoes lived along the spine of mountains that runs from the Andes in Bolivia and Chile up northward through the Rocky Mountains. Those mountains are the homeland of potatoes, and all 4,500 named varieties trace their ancestry back to that zone. And people living in this region, and what's called the American Cordillera, this run of mountains, they've been eating potatoes since time out of mind. Stone tools and preserved potato peels show that wild potatoes were being prepared for food in southern Utah and in south central Chile nearly 13,000 years ago. And their domestication dates from around 7,800 BCE. And potatoes formed an important part of the diet of many of the cultures inhabiting the 9,000 kilometers between Utah and Chile. So that's a wide range that potatoes were being eaten from. And together with foods like quinoa and maize, they provided a robust, starchy background for cuisines that were also enlivened by chili peppers, lots of other vegetables, beans, and a whole variety of other foodstuffs. Each variety, each of the 4,500 odd varieties of potatoes that we know today, and many of the ones that existed in the past, can be propagated from a potato mother tuber. Many people apparently during this pandemic have taken to backyard gardening, and potatoes have been a popular crop to be growing at home. And so some of you may yourself be growing potatoes, and as you know, you cultivate them from seed potatoes, and they grow from what's called a potato mother tuber. And I like the name potato mother tuber. I think she sounds like an ancient deity, but in botanical terms, it just refers to the shoots that provide the genetic material from which additional plants are cultivated. But in fact, potato mother is the name of a deity that Andean people revered in the Inca Empire and before that. Her name in Quechua, the language of the Incas, is Axamama. And she's sister to the maize mother, Saramama. And so Axamama, the potato mother, guarded over the earth's fertility, overseeing the growth of potatoes and all the other things necessary for sustenance. And she watched over the potato fields of the Andes, which scientists very suggestively call the tuber's cradle area. And she cared for her tuberous offspring for millennia during the period when potatoes were becoming more and more common in the Andes as a source of food. Now, this sort of female generative language, potato mother, the cradle area, it takes us back, I think, to these connections between people and potatoes. So I was suggesting at the very start, and it might have seemed somewhat fanciful, that talking about people, talking about potatoes is a way of talking about ourselves. But in fact, we can also see this in poetry. The great Irish poet Seamus Heaney used potatoes to evoke his complex relationship between himself and his parents. And he does this in some of his best loved poems that are taught at secondary school as part of the curriculum in Britain, for example. In these poems, he describes how peeling potatoes with his mother or watching his father dig a ground for potatoes, how this evoked in Heaney both his own heritage, his own sense of connection to his past, and also his sometimes ambivalent relationship towards that ancestry. In a poem about the Irish famine, for example, Heaney cursed the potato as what he called a black mother because of the way that the potato rot that destroyed the Irish harvest in the 19th century famine, how it turned the potatoes black. And he cursed her as this bad mother who had failed her children. So potatoes as a mother. For the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, who like Seamus Heaney also won the Nobel Prize for Literature, the potato was a father. And so playing off the similarities in Spanish between the words for potato and for papa, for father, Neruda saluted the potato as his father, a dark-skinned native just like Neruda himself. So we can see in poetry the way that people play around with these ideas that we and the potato share some common heritage. Well, the Irish poetry that I just mentioned by Seamus Heaney, of course, brings to mind the terrible Irish famine and the deaths of perhaps 1 million people in Ireland alone, more across the continent. It's worth recalling that the potato blight that struck Ireland in 1845 also destroyed potato harvests across mainland Europe, causing hundreds of thousands of deaths there as well. And for people in 19th century Europe, the potato-based Irish economy and the Irish famine were exhibit A in many debates about the emergence of a capitalist world and the capitalist market. So 19th century nutritionists deplored what they called sluggish potato blood that you acquired from a potato-heavy diet. And nutritionists blamed the malign influence of the tuber for Ireland's continued status as an oppressed colony. Poor Ireland, proclaimed one German nutritionist. With your potato-heavy diet, you can never free yourself from English rule. Your diet makes you sluggish and slow, whereas the blood of meat flows through the veins of your English conquerors, he wrote. And economists and other writers likewise blame sluggish economic performance of other nations, again, on a potato-heavy diet. And you can find charts from the 19th century that correlate economic prowess with the prevalence or absence of potatoes. And one of the themes that I've tried to trace out in Feeding the People is the ways in which the diets of ordinary people acquired political relevance from the 18th century onward. And perhaps surprisingly, the changing fortunes of the potato as a political instrument offer a way of telling the story of the increasing conviction by politicians and statesmen and others that a flourishing economy and a strong state required a robust and healthy population of workers. And during the 18th century, potatoes were seen as an excellent way of creating this hardy population of robust workers who were going to fuel industry and power the economy, provide strong military bases, etc. So in the 18th century, potatoes were celebrated as this way of building a strong state. And indeed, Ireland was held up as a wonderful example of what could be achieved with a potato-heavy diet. But by the 19th century, changes in how states thought about governing meant that the potato began to seem an impediment to economic and political success. What hope is there for a nation that lives on potatoes? Exclaimed a British official in 1848. And his view, as I've already suggested, was widely echoed by other 19th century commentators. And this sort of dismissive view of the potato persisted well into the 20th century. When the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization was set up in the aftermath of the Second World War, it unsurprisingly devoted sustained attention to improving the world's food supply. That was one of the principal goals of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. But its ambitious plans accorded no space at all to the modest potato, or indeed to other tubers, which the UN's own data showed fed perhaps 50% of the world relied on such tubers for sustenance. But these sorts of foods, according to these grand post-war organizations, were not relevant in addressing issues of food security. So well into the 20th century, potatoes continued to be seen as a marginal crop that didn't contribute to food security in this way, a view that went back, as I've suggested, to the 19th century. But at the same time, by the 1970s, when the UN and other organizations were dismissing potatoes as irrelevant to food security, ordinary people all around the world had come to rely on potatoes as a source of sustenance. The European invasion of the Americas after 1492 with Columbus and over the 16th century, as Spanish colonizers in particular conquered indigenous kingdoms all across the Americas, that process set in motion a whole whirlwind that blew potatoes all around the world, where they found a ready welcome in the gardens and crofts of peasants and small farmers from northern China to Sweden. And so the other theme that I've tried to explore in Feeding the People is the surprising agency of these nameless farmers in converting potatoes from an exotic import to an ordinary staple. Many of the earlier histories that recount the potatoes spread around the world credit far-sighted aristocrats for convincing superstitious and conservative peasants to eat this novel food. And individuals such as Frederick the Great feature prominently in these histories as working hard to convince ordinary people that they could eat potatoes. Well, Feeding the People tries to offer a very different account of how all around the world people learned to eat potatoes. And its protagonists are not enlightened monarchs, but rather these nameless courtiers and hill farmers who invested the time and the effort necessary to adapt the Andean tuber to the great variety of climates and terrains in which we know that it can flourish. And recognizing the contribution of largely unnamed peasants to the history of the potato and to the history of how we eat ourselves today, recognizing their contribution to this is not simply a matter of historical justice. It's not simply a matter of looking back in the past and saying, well, look at that, well done you, nameless peasants. It's also relevant, I think, to our future. Biodiversity is today identified as an essential component of both long-term environmental sustainability and global food security. And this essential biodiversity, in turn, relies on the expertise of the world's small farmers, who are now acknowledged to be the most important counterweight to the forces of highly homogenized, large-scale commercial agriculture. This sort of peasant agriculture values and promotes crop diversity. It's not typically characterized by superstition, inertia, and the reflexive replication of past practices, as some of the older histories of the potato suggested. In fact, even the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the same organization that in the post-war years was dismissing potatoes as not relevant to global food security, they also now hail the local knowledge that underpins traditional potato cultivation as a key global food security resource. And they celebrate this small-scale peasant agriculture as an important contribution to global food security today. In fact, the United Nations in 2008 declared that the International Year of the Potato precisely to celebrate the potato's major contribution to global food security. So I think the potato's history reminds us not to overlook the contributions of small-scale agriculture to the larger history of innovation and change. And I want to end by thinking a little bit more about the importance of these small histories. Another of the themes that I sought to explore in Feeding the People was the ways in which our daily diets, the ways that we eat, how we think about food, how these small personal matters are in fact connected to really huge changes, to the really large changes that have taken place in the last 500 years. The emergence of capitalism, I think, is a good instance of that. But at the same time, as I've tried to think about how we can use food and the history of the potato to see how our lives are embedded in these broader histories, I'm also interested in the ways in which ordinary people, well, let me say a little bit more about that. I should have maybe elaborate a little bit more to say that not only are our lives embedded in these larger processes, but that actually we ourselves make history through our own small actions. And the potato farmers who I've been celebrating a moment ago, who around the world learned how to cultivate potatoes all around the world, they changed how the world eats. These small farmers are responsible for changing the diet of people all around the world. But I think that doesn't mean that our actions are important only when they change the world. I think that potatoes, again, can remind us of this. And I want to say a little bit in conclusion about this. And potatoes are a byword for comfort food, comfort being something I think that we're all seeking, particularly at the present moment. And I think potatoes, this par excellence comfort food, can also remind us of the small consolations and comforts that we derive from our own small domesticities, not because those things are necessarily of earth-shaking and world-shaping importance, but because they give us this small degree of comfort. I've been thinking about the comfort and the consolation that can be derived from potatoes for as long as I've been working on this book, really. And I want to think a little bit about what the consolation of potatoes might look like. And my mind sort of played with this idea because there's a very famous book called The Consolation of Philosophy that was composed by a Roman philosopher called Boethius in the 6th century while he was awaiting execution. And he wrote this meditation on the human condition called The Consolation of Philosophy. And during this period, Boethius had suffered an absolutely terrible reversal in his own fortunes. At the time of his arrest in 523 CE, he was a high-ranking official in the services of the Emperor Theodoric, the king of the Ostrogoths. And disagreements between Boethius and Theodoric resulted first in the philosopher's imprisonment and ultimately in his execution. And this book, The Consolation of Philosophy, that he composed while awaiting execution, is both a response to these events, and it's also a larger exploration of the aims and ends of human life. And it consists of a dialogue between Boethius and Lady Philosophy. And they together discuss the nature of happiness, the origins of evil, the transcendence of divine love, a whole series of topics. And it was for the next 1,000-odd years enormously influential, very widely read. Scholars today are divided over whether Lady Philosophy succeeded in offering Boethius the inner peace that he sought, but the Consolation of Philosophy makes clear that insofar as earthly happiness is possible at all, it doesn't lie in worldly fame, but rather in self-knowledge, in philosophy. So, well, the consolation of potatoes, I think, is more modest, but it's also philosophical. And it lies in the potato's solid ordinariness and its ability to root us in the common ground. The Estonian composer Arvo Pärt commented in 2016 that when he was overwhelmed by the difficulties of a composition, he sought refuge in potatoes. On such occasions, he told Gramophone magazine, "I peel potatoes. It calms me down." And this routine domestic task, through its very concreteness, he felt, facilitated the creative work of the imagination. The contemplative act of peeling a potato refocuses the mind away from the outer world and into an inner space of creativity and maybe solace. The Irish poet Seamus Heaney perhaps experienced something similar as he sat peeling potatoes with his mother, the silence broken only by little pleasant splashes of peel falling into a basin of water, a memory he described in one of his best-loved poems. And Pierre Bezukhov, the protagonist of Tolstoy's War and Peace, also found comfort in a potato. Tolstoy's novel, set during Napoleon's unsuccessful invasion of Russia in the early 19th century, is ultimately concerned with the place of the individual in the impersonal sweep of history. And for Tolstoy, the value of human life lay precisely in its prosaic ordinariness, in the small virtues that bind us together. And over the course of the novel, his protagonist, Pierre, journeys from a state of isolation and despair towards an appreciation that he forms part of a web of connections linking not only men and women, but also the entire universe together. And this new appreciation develops through an encounter with a man and a baked potato. Pierre has been captured by French troops along with innumerable other Russians, and disoriented and desolate, he languishes in a dark hut, isolated from himself and from everybody else. But at length, Pierre perceived another presence in this hut. Another presence in which he senses, he didn't write, Tolstoy wrote, something pleasant, soothing, and rounded. Can you think of something pleasant, soothing, and rounded? I'm sure you can. Well, his fellow prisoner is a peasant called Platon Karatayev, who offers Pierre a baked potato with salt, along with some advice that represents Tolstoy's own worldview. And the simple baked potato sprinkled with salt encapsulates this message that Karatayev conveys. Get on with other people and be grateful for the things that you have. The earthly baked potato is a still center point in this maelstrom of history that spins around Pierre, and it symbolizes both the consolation of small things and also humanity itself. Munching on his baked potato, Pierre muses that he has never tasted anything so good. Karatayev's solid, salty potato helped restore in a despairing Pierre some sense of hope. A consolation indeed. The sturdy, round Karatayev and his baked potato mirror each other, people and potatoes, and in their solidity and concreteness, they help Pierre appreciate his own connections to the cosmos. Looking out at the starry sky, Pierre comes to realize that, as he says, all that is mine, all that is in me, all that is me. And the straightforward prayer that Karatayev offers at bedtime reiterates the message of the potato. Lord, lay me down like a stone, raise me up like a loaf. Bread, stone, potato, each person, life itself, flow into each other. And from the stony potato, life rises up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for a really fascinating talk. And I think that really shows what a kind of extraordinary history an apparently ordinary foodstuff can really yield. So, it's really great insights into the book. Just while we're waiting, everyone, please, if you've got questions, put them into the chat now. I just thought I would kick things off while we're waiting. So I know this is actually your second book on potatoes, because you wrote the very short book on potatoes as well. And so what was it that kind of first, made you think that, you were going to look seriously at potatoes?
I think it came out of my interest in the history of Spanish America, and actually in the previous big project that I did, I became very interested in the ways in which the foods in general shaped the experience of colonialism in Spanish America. So I was interested in what European conquistadors and settlers who traveled to the Americas in 1500, what they thought happened to their bodies when they ate unfamiliar foods from the Americas, potatoes included. So I became quite interested in the potato's role in the specific history of Spanish colonialism. But I was also conscious at the same time that potatoes were, at the very moment that they were playing, I think, a quite important role in shaping the colonial experience in Spanish America. They were traveling all over the world. They reached India by the early 17th century, and they were disseminated all across Europe and many different parts of the world. And so I became quite interested in how this happened, how this food that came from a very specific place became ordinary absolutely everywhere. And it also really got up my nose that there was this standard history of the potato that said peasants are conservative, ordinary people are conservative, they won't eat anything unless their great-grandfathers ate it. If it's not mentioned in the Bible, early modern European peasants wouldn't touch a food. So it took aristocrats and benevolent, far-sighted individuals to convince them to try this new food. And I thought, that is not right. And so I was on sort of a mission for some years to collect examples of peasants eating potatoes in Europe long before aristocrats were interested in them. So I think it was this dual sense that I was interested in how a food from one place became a food from everywhere. And also I was dissatisfied by what seemed to me the injustice that was being done to these early agricultural pioneers by the existing scholarship. Mm-hmm. And I guess out of that, also I'm quite interested in potatoes. I enjoy cooking as a source of relaxation and pleasure, and I was interested in thinking about the ways in which my own life was shaped by these larger historical forces.
Mm-hmm. I was going to have a follow-up one on that. As many people have probably in recent weeks, I've been watching some of the Down to Earth with Zac Efron programs, and in one of the programs there was the potato featured quite prominently, and there was quite a lot of discussion around sort of food piracy and So obviously your early modernists, sort of traveling to Spanish America, to what degree was there a kind of sense of, sort of food piracy, food security, an awareness of, sort of transferring, sort of crops from one region to another?
Well, that's a very good question. There was a very deliberate process. I mean, not so much in the very early colonial period, but by the 18th century, there was a really deliberate process that was undertaken by a number of different European colonial powers to relocate the production of important foodstuffs into areas of European influence. That happened, for example, with coffee, which was really a crop that was produced in the Levant outside of the area of European control. And colonizers such as the French, for example, very deliberately tried to create a coffee industry, first in the Caribbean and also in some of their Indian Ocean islands, so as to bring control of this crop within the purview of the French state. So, I mean, you could consider that a process of biopiracy in some sense. With the potato, that happened less because it was not an important commercial crop really until the 19th century. But I think in the last 40 years or so, I think there has been some concern about a certain amount of biopiracy going on. I mean, it's in the US with a particular anxiety about China. Mm-hmm. Looking at interesting hybrids. So there is a sort of history of this process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really interesting. I think we've got some other questions. I will duck out and leave you to answer those now.
Okay. Yes. Okay. One question says, "Hello, the Great Ireland Famine of the 18th century, due to the failure of potatoes coming to Ireland from the Americas, does it show the dependency of Europeans on the colonies?" Well, yes, this is a really good example. So the fact that potatoes have become such an important part of the Irish diet, for example, certainly by the 18th century, and absolutely by the 19th century, which was when the really catastrophic famine occurred, but there were famines before that and subsequently as well. It absolutely shows how the European diet was fundamentally transformed by colonialism, which is interesting, and I mean, in a number of different ways, but it also makes very ironic the fact that by the 19th century, in fact earlier, but certainly by the 19th century, when European colonizers were traveling to other parts of the world, they saw the potato as a European product that demonstrated the superiority of European agriculture. So British colonists in India tried to promote potato cultivation during the period of when India was a British colony, holding it up as an example of the superiority of European agriculture. So the Andean potato became a symbol in the minds of colonizers of the superiority of Europe. But it absolutely shows this dependency on the colonies. I think that's a really good point. So there's a question about the Green Revolution and the effects to standardize potatoes in South America and to introduce more efficient, high-yield tubers. How did peasants and consumers react and resist and adapt to these state efforts? So, yeah, another really good question. So over the course of the 20th century, biologists developed very powerful tools to breed more productive or to breed specific qualities into plants of all sorts, potatoes included. And many of the efforts at breeding improved scientific varieties of food staples focused on the major commercially traded foodstuffs such as maize or wheat or rice or sorghum. So there was a big push, particularly in the 1960s, often called the Green Revolution, which introduced a whole variety of hybridized, scientifically bred foodstuffs and grains in particular that possessed a number of advantages over locally grown varieties, but also many disadvantages. There was less effort put into breeding potatoes, but there was nonetheless a substantial effort in those countries where potatoes were a particularly important foodstuff. So in South America, for example, there were scientific expeditions and scientific institutes that were set up in Peru, in Bolivia, and Colombia, and a number of different places to try to breed what scholars sometimes call these scientific potatoes, And some of the well-known varieties in Peru now, for example, are the result of those efforts. So there was this move on the one hand in some of these countries to try to produce scientific potatoes, but there has also been an interesting history of resistance to, as the question was implying, to these scientific varieties. And lately, the Peruvian state has got quite interested in trying to protect some of the heritage varieties, which are now seen as sort of national resources. So there's some interesting programs going on where there's cooperation between some of the big potato breeding institutes and small peasant communities in the Andes to try to, as they put it, repatriate some of the heritage varieties back out into communities where they might have been lost, and to encourage the preservation of these heritage varieties. So there's an interesting dialogue going on between, big breeding institutes and peasants. Let's see. How did I come to study the politics of the potato? Well, I guess I became, to go back to, well, Michael was asking me, why did I become interested in potatoes at all? And I said it really annoyed me that the aristocrats, the wrong people were getting the credit, it seemed to me, for publicizing potatoes. And as part of that, I became interested in why anybody might think in the first place that it was aristocrats who taught the world to eat potatoes. So I got quite interested in that. And it was in the 18th century that aristocrats became interested in potatoes. Frederick the Great did indeed encourage potato cultivation across German lands, but he wasn't the first person, he wasn't doing this because nobody was eating potatoes, but he did become very interested in the 18th century in promoting potatoes. So I became interested in why was it that, given that potatoes had been eaten for hundreds of years in Europe, why in the 18th century did members of the aristocracy start to become interested in them? And I think it has to do with politics and changing ideas about what a state ought to do. So I think that's how I got interested in the politics of potatoes in particular. There's a question about what I can say about the future of the potato, biologically or culturally. Well, historians don't like predicting the future. We always say, oh, that's very hard to tell. But I have been really struck how during this pandemic, there has been a growing interest in people cultivating food on a small scale. So people who hadn't really been who had gardens but hadn't been using it to grow foodstuffs have got quite interested in this. Among the things there have been shortages of, alongside loo roll and pasta and hand sanitizer, have actually been garden seeds and also seed potatoes. So I'm curious about whether the terrible experiences that we're all living through with this pandemic are going to change people's ideas about the way they want to be sourcing their food, whether these ideas will stick or whether this will just be a short-term experience during the pandemic. And if they do stick, I think potatoes may come to occupy a place in people's small-scale horticultural activities. But we'll see. As I said, we're not necessarily good at predicting the future. A question, can I speak a bit about the transition from the 18th century utopian hopes for the potato and the 19th century denigration of potato eaters? What is the relationship between scientific knowledge and social political ideology in this transition? Yeah, another good question. So in the 18th century, when states started to think about building up a healthy population as a resource alongside mines or factories or forests, 18th century statesmen started thinking about the population as a resource that you needed to look after to some degree. You needed to think about having a healthy population that would make you stronger than other countries that had feebler populations, and you would, be more successful militarily. And so this was connected to a larger idea about how you governed that was really, rather large scale and high level, about thinking about what it meant to have a healthy population, and that you just wanted robust workers, ideally people who grew their own food and sustained themselves separate from the market with potatoes, for example, on top of which that would then allow you to have a surplus of grain. You could export this surplus of grain to some other country that hadn't figured out how to look after its population so well. You'd have a positive balance of trade. you'd have a healthy population, everything would be very excellent. By the 19th century, ideas about how you governed and what you needed to do to have a flourishing economy had changed with really the development of the ideas of capitalist political economy and the emergence of the market as a really powerful way of structuring trade. And so thinking changed, and with that changed ideas about what kind of population you wanted. So you no longer wanted a sort of stolid population of robust peasants who lived separate from the market. That was the last thing you wanted. You wanted a finely tuned population of proletarianized workers who could work in factories and industries as, finely tuned machines working in linen mills or in other forms of industry. The last thing you wanted was this peasant population who were separate from the market, eating potatoes that they grew themselves. And so changing ideas about how you governed went hand in hand with changing ideas about nutrition. And over the course of the 19th century, nutritionists became more and more pessimistic about the merits of the potato as a basis for a national economy. And so where Ireland had once been the illustration of all the wonderful things that could be achieved with a potato-eating peasant population, it then became an illustration of everything that was wrong with a peasant economy that was divorced from the market. And so when Karl Marx said, oh, the French peasantry are a sack of potatoes, he meant they're not connected to the political world, they can't act politically, they're backward, they're stuck in the past. So I think these things all connect together in that way. So let me see, here's another question. One of the most memorable moments for me when I visited Schloss Sanssouci in Potsdam was seeing the potatoes placed on Frederick the Great's tombstone in gratitude for introducing the potato to Prussia, subsequently Germany. The potatoes are placed on the grave every day. Yes, I've seen that too. It's really striking. And it illustrates the power of these stories about these 18th century potato heroes who supposedly brought potatoes to the masses. There are very similar things happen in France on the tomb of Parmentier, who is the French equivalent of Frederick the Great, the great potato hero who supposedly introduced the potato to France. He didn't do that at all, but he certainly popularized them. And so I love these votive potatoes that you see placed on these tombs. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And then a question, was there ever a medicinal use of potatoes? Well, yeah, so I've read, this is from a question from my colleague at work, hello. And so I would like to say that in a recent Chinese publication, which I read in translation, but about the use of potatoes, it stresses the enormous variety of medicinal uses of potatoes, which are described as actually being an anti-senescence food, that's to say that they can fight against dementia, to being something that has an antiseptic quality that you can place on mashed potatoes placed on wounds, supposedly have an antiseptic quality. So recent publications extol the myriad medicinal uses of potatoes, not to mention medicinal uses further in the past. So a question that says, I was much struck and applaud your pointing to the agency of nameless farmers over the century. At the same time, you also talk of potatoes traveling around the world. Would it not be appropriate to accord the potato agency for traveling, but to point to the mostly nameless explorers, seafarers, and more who took the potatoes with them, presumably to keep them going when traveling or to plant when they got there? Yes, absolutely. Also from another hello, and thank you for the comment. That's a very, very correct point. And so, and there's an interesting scholarship on how sailors were innovators in a variety of ways. There's a nice article I've read about the way in which sailors in the 18th century spread new clothing fashions around the world. And I think they spread new plants as well. And travelers of all sorts have done this as well. So certainly among the many nameless people who spread potatoes, we should also doff our caps, I think, to sailors, seafarers, and other travelers of one sort or another, who are absolutely the people who took potatoes around the world. Potato, unlike the coconut, didn't float around under its own steam. Another question: how much did the aristocracy shape the way we eat potatoes today, as compared to how they were eaten in the Andes? So yeah, so this is a question about consumption that I haven't really addressed particularly. So they did and they didn't. So certainly the way that potatoes are eaten in other parts of the world bears doesn't bear close resemblance to the ways that they're eaten in the Andes. Well, it bears some resemblance. So all over the world, potatoes are recognized as being an excellent addition to stews and other soupy, stewy things, that you can add potatoes to other vegetables. They extend flavor. They will amplify meat if you're adding some meat. So potatoes are eaten in that way and have been eaten in that way in the Andes for many hundreds of years, thousands of years as well. So there's certain similarities, but in many ways, the really striking thing about the way potatoes are consumed around the world is the diversity of the ways in which they're consumed. I mean, if we think of, how are potatoes eaten in Britain? The vast majority in fried forms or highly processed forms, totally unknown in the Andes, which didn't do deep frying. There was no, frying things was not an Inca way of preparing foods at all. But this was a question specifically about the aristocracy. So I guess I would say relatively little, because the distinctive early modern aristocratic contribution to potato cuisine is one that I think has fallen totally into abeyance. And this is the potato pie or potato pudding. Something else I got sort of obsessed with it at one moment. I think I have nearly 70 early modern recipes for potato puddings. These are sweet puddings where something like, if anybody's ever had a pumpkin pie, a little bit like that, where you mash up potatoes and you mix it with egg and sugar and sweet wine and nutmeg and cinnamon and raisins and a whole variety of sweet substances to make a sort of potato custard, which you will either boil to make a pudding or you would bake it in a tart shell. These were incredibly popular in the 17th century and were an aristocratic dish. These were not a peasant foodstuff by any means, but they were enormously popular. Many cookbooks from the 17th and 18th century have such recipes. Some of them call for a dozen eggs. They're expensive foodstuffs, not to mention the sugar. So I think that's sunk without trace as a foodstuff. I've tried them, and I think you could do better things with a potato. So certainly that was an aristocratic contribution that hasn't stuck. The other thing, I will shut up about ways of cooking potatoes in a minute, but the other distinctively Andean way of preparing potatoes, which persists to the present day, is freeze drying. So freeze-dried instant mashed potato, the sort, branded products such as Smash, actually have a long history and go back to ancient Andean preparation techniques where you dry out potatoes in the cold air of the high Andes, and then once they're dried out, you smash them into a powder, which you can resuscitate with water. So a technique that also hasn't particularly traveled around the world. So there are quite distinctive ways, this freeze-dried potato in particular, where potatoes have historically been prepared with in the Andes, which are quite different from the aristocratic vogue for highly sweetened potato pies and puddings of the early modern period. So yeah, that's I won't say anything more about cooking, but that's a very good question. I see
just before we wrap up, I was going to just ask you about your experience with, because there's a number of recipes in the book, and with your experience, obviously some were presumably more palatable than others. I don't know, like your experience sort of recreating those recipes.
Yeah, so that was an enjoyable and I hope useful part of the book, is I've included for each chapter a recipe that in some way encapsulates the features of the potato during the period that chapter examines. And I tried them all out. The recipes all work. And so some of them are more appealing than others. But it's sort of interesting. It shows that there's, as they say, there's no accounting for taste. And one of the potato recipes that got the most diverse reaction was a famous 18th century potato soup recipe that became a kind of a sort of European phenomenon. There's a particular recipe for potato soup that was served at soup kitchens in the 18th century across Europe. I didn't include this precise recipe, but a different recipe for potato soup. But tested out this particular famous 18th century potato soup recipe on a number of colleagues. It's a very thick, vinegary potato soup that involved, well, a lot of vinegar and has a quite sharp flavor. I mean, somewhat, if you imagine sort of a fish and chips doused with vinegar converted into a cream soup. And it got a very diverse reaction. It's a German, the recipe is ultimately German. And I tried it out on a collection of friends, including 2 Germans, both of whom said they thought it was delicious, one of whom had a second bowl. Most of the British people I sampled it on, tried it on, found it unpalatable, wouldn't have more than a few spoonfuls, except for one person who said it was slightly reminiscent of fish and chips and they liked it. But there was a really quite clear divide over this potato soup. So yeah, the recipes have had varied success, but they're all historically quite interesting.
So you can buy the book and test the recipes out. It's interactive.